My granddaughter slapped me across the face at my 70th birthday dinner and told me I was nothing but a burden who should have died years ago, and the sound of it cut through the room so sharply that every conversation stopped in an instant. My head snapped to the side. My glasses flew from my face, and before I could steady myself, my body hit the edge of the mahogany sideboard and I collapsed onto the floor, the impact sending a sharp pain through my ribs as I tasted blood filling my mouth, warm and metallic, dripping down onto the cream silk blouse I had carefully chosen for that night. The same blouse I had saved for what was meant to be a celebration of a life well lived. And for a moment I could not even breathe properly, not from the pain, but from the shock of what had just happened. 23 people were sitting around that table. Friends, colleagues, family, people who had known me for years, and yet not one of them moved, not one hand reached out to help me up, not one voice spoke to stop what was unfolding. They simply stared as if frozen in place, watching a 70-year-old woman lying on the floor of her own home after being struck by the very person she had raised with everything she had. And when I forced myself to look up, I saw her standing over me, her face cold, her eyes sharp, her expression twisted into something I no longer recognized. As if the girl I had once held in my arms had disappeared completely and been replaced by someone who saw me not as family, but as an obstacle. "You should have died years ago," she said again, her voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear, and those words hit harder than the slap itself. They settled into the room like something heavy and final, and in that moment I realized that this was not anger, not a passing outburst. This was how she truly saw me, after everything I had given, after every sacrifice, after every year spent building a life that included her at its center. I was nothing more than a burden in her eyes. Something to be removed so she could finally take what she believed should already belong to her. I lay there for a few seconds longer than I should have, not because I could not stand, but because I needed to understand what I was feeling, and what I felt was not humiliation, not even heartbreak, but clarity, a cold and precise awareness that something irreversible had just happened, that a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed, and as the silence stretched around me, broken only by the faint clink of a glass settling on the table, I made a decision without speaking a single word. A decision that would begin before the night was over and would finish before the next morning began. A decision that none of them, especially my granddaughter, could have possibly seen coming. For 42 years, I had built my life piece by piece, starting with nothing more than a borrowed desk, a secondhand typewriter, and a determination that refused to bend, and over time that fragile beginning became Whitcomb Publishing, a company that grew into one of the most respected independent publishing houses on the East Coast. But the truth was that the business itself was never the most important thing I created, because at the center of everything was my family, especially my granddaughter Caroline, the child I had raised after my daughter Margaret passed away far too young, leaving behind a little girl who clung to a teddy bear and cried herself to sleep night after night in a house that suddenly felt too large and too empty. I became everything to that child, not just a grandmother, but a mother, a protector, a constant presence who refused to let her feel alone in a world that had already taken too much from her. I sat beside her bed reading stories until her breathing slowed. I held her when she woke from nightmares. I paid for her education, her hobbies, her dreams. Every opportunity she ever had was something I made possible through years of work that she never had to witness. And I did it willingly, not out of obligation, but out of love, because I believed that giving her a better life was the greatest purpose I could fulfill. When she grew older, I continued to support her in every way I could. I funded her studies. I welcomed her into my company. I gave her a position others would have spent years earning. And when she married into a wealthy family, I still stood beside her, providing the foundation that allowed her to step confidently into that world, never once asking for recognition, never once reminding her of what it had taken to build it all, because I believed that love did not keep score. But as I stood there in that dining room earlier that night, before everything fell apart, I had already begun to sense something changing. Small details that others might have ignored, the way she avoided eye contact when she arrived, the way she spoke without warmth, the way she carried herself not with gratitude, but with entitlement, as if the life she had been given was not a gift, but something she deserved by default. And even then, I chose to say nothing, because part of me still believed that beneath the surface, the child I had raised was still there, still capable of remembering who we were to each other. Now, lying on the floor with blood on my lip and silence all around me, I understood how wrong I had been, because the truth was not something that appeared suddenly in that moment. It had been building quietly over years, shaped by expectations, influences, and choices I could no longer control. And what happened at that table was not the beginning of the problem, it was the revelation of it, the moment when everything hidden finally came into the light. And for the first time in my life, I saw my granddaughter not as the child I had loved, but as the person she had chosen to become. The dinner itself had been planned with care, every detail chosen to reflect warmth, gratitude, and the quiet pride of reaching 70 surrounded by people who mattered. The table sat in the same dining room where Caroline had celebrated birthdays as a child, where laughter had once come easily, where memories had been built over decades without ever imagining a night like this could exist. I had arranged the seating myself, placing each guest with intention, ensuring conversation would flow, ensuring everyone felt welcome, because that was the kind of host I had always been, thoughtful, deliberate, attentive to the smallest things that made people feel valued. But from the moment Caroline arrived, something felt wrong, not dramatically, not in a way that would cause immediate alarm, but in subtle shifts that carried a different kind of weight. She was late, nearly 40 minutes, and when she entered the room she did not greet me, did not hug me, did not even offer a simple birthday wish. Her attention moved past me as if I were part of the background, her eyes scanning the room, assessing, calculating, and in that instant I felt something unfamiliar, not pain, but distance, as though I were already being moved out of my own place in her world. When we sat down for dinner, I noticed that my name card had been moved from the head of the table to the far end near the kitchen door, and hers had been placed where mine had always been, a small act on the surface, something that could have been dismissed as harmless, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. It was not a mistake, it was a statement, a quiet declaration of control made without asking, without discussion, without respect. And though every instinct in me recognized it, I chose to say nothing. I simply picked up my plate and moved to the seat she had assigned me, because I refused to create a scene, not on that night, not in front of those people. As the evening continued, the tension grew in ways that could not be easily named but could certainly be felt. Caroline drank more than usual, her laughter sharper, her tone increasingly dismissive. Preston murmured to her more than once as if trying to calm something that was building beneath the surface, but she brushed him off each time, and the conversations around the table began to falter, small pauses stretching longer than they should, glances exchanged between guests who sensed that something was unfolding but did not yet understand what it would become. And then, just as the main course was being served, Caroline stood up, lifting her glass in a way that suggested a toast, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that perhaps everything I had felt earlier had been wrong, that she was about to say something kind, something that would bring the evening back to what it was meant to be. But instead, as the room fell silent and all attention turned to her, she smiled in a way that felt rehearsed, controlled, and she began to speak, not as a granddaughter celebrating her grandmother, but as someone claiming a stage she believed already belonged to her, and in that moment, I understood that the night was no longer mine. Caroline's voice carried clearly across the table as she made her announcement, and with each word the air in the room seemed to tighten. She spoke about Whitcomb Publishing as if it were already hers, as if the years I had spent building it were nothing more than a prelude to her taking control. She said that starting next week she would be stepping in as chief executive officer, that the company needed new energy, new vision, something modern and forward-thinking, and while her tone remained polished on the surface, there was an edge beneath it, a quiet dismissal of everything that had come before, including me. I felt my fingers tighten around the stem of my wine glass, not out of anger but out of disbelief, because this was not a conversation we had ever had, not privately, not professionally, and certainly not in front of a room full of guests at my own birthday dinner. And yet she spoke as though the decision had already been made, as though my role in the company I had built was something that could simply be replaced at her convenience, reduced to a footnote in a story she intended to take over. I stood up slowly, steadying myself, keeping my voice calm as I told her this was neither the time nor the place, that we could discuss the future of the company in my office where it belonged, away from an audience, away from the performance she was creating. But she did not sit down, she did not hesitate. Instead, she smiled in a way that felt final, as if she had been waiting for this moment, and she refused, saying that we would talk about it now because I had already had my time, because I was 70 years old and should be stepping aside, because in her eyes I was no longer leading, I was delaying what she believed was inevitable. There was a shift in the room then, something that could not be ignored anymore. The guests were no longer simply uncomfortable, they were witnessing something deeply wrong, something that had crossed beyond awkwardness into disrespect. Harrison set his fork down carefully. Franklin stared in stunned silence. Dorothy's expression tightened with concern, but still, no one intervened, because what was happening was so unexpected, so completely out of place, that no one knew how to stop it without making it worse. I asked her, one last time, to sit down and apologize, not for my sake but for her own, because I understood where this path was leading and I was giving her the opportunity to step away from it, to regain control before she crossed a line that could not be undone. But instead of listening, she laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed across the table, and then she moved toward me with deliberate steps, closing the distance between us in a way that made everything suddenly feel very small and very final, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would change everything between us forever. She stopped just a step away from me, close enough that I could see every detail in her expression, the tightness in her jaw, the cold certainty in her eyes, and when she spoke again her voice dropped, no longer meant for the entire table, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. She asked if I had any idea how humiliating it had been for her to live in my shadow, to work in a company where everyone saw her as nothing more than the boss's granddaughter, to be judged by Preston's family as someone who had been handed everything without earning it. And as she spoke, the resentment poured out of her in a way that made it clear this had been building for years, hidden beneath polite conversations and forced smiles. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear it fully, to understand exactly what she believed. And what I heard was not just frustration, but entitlement twisted into something sharper, something that had convinced her that the life she had been given was a limitation rather than a privilege, that my presence was the reason she felt small, that my success was the obstacle standing between her and the identity she wanted to claim for herself. Then she said it, the words that cut deeper than anything else that night, that I was a burden, that I should have died years ago, and for a fraction of a second, everything inside me went still, not from weakness, but from the sheer finality of what she had just chosen to say, because those were not words that could be taken back, not words that could be explained away or softened later. They revealed something fundamental, something irreversible about how she saw me. I took a step back instinctively, my body reacting before my mind could fully process it, my hip brushing against the edge of the sideboard, and in that split second, before I could regain my balance or respond, her hand came up and struck my face with a force that echoed through the room, the sound sharp and sudden, like something breaking, my head snapping to the side as my glasses flew off and hit the wood, and then the floor came up to meet me as I lost my footing completely. The pain came a moment later, spreading through my ribs, my shoulder, my lip, but even then, it was not the physical impact that defined that moment. It was the silence that followed, the absolute stillness of a room full of people who had just witnessed something that should never have happened. And as I lay there, tasting blood, feeling the weight of everything that had just unfolded, I understood with perfect clarity that this was the end of something, not just a relationship strained or damaged, but a bond that had been broken beyond repair, and from that understanding, something else began to form, something quiet, controlled, and far more powerful than anger. For a few seconds after the impact, I remained on the floor, not because I was unable to stand, but because I was choosing what to do next, the room around me still frozen in shock, the weight of 23 silent witnesses pressing down harder than the pain in my ribs, and in that stillness, something inside me settled with absolute clarity. This was not a moment for emotion, not a moment for confrontation, but a moment for decision. Harrison was the first to move, pushing his chair back and coming toward me with the steady composure of a man who understood the seriousness of what had just occurred. Dorothy close behind him, her hands already reaching for a napkin to press gently against my lip. Their presence grounded me, not because I needed help standing, but because it reminded me that not everyone in that room had chosen silence, that there were still people who understood the difference between right and wrong without needing to be told. "I can stand," I said quietly, and with their support I rose to my feet, every movement controlled, deliberate. I adjusted my blouse, smoothed my hair, not out of vanity, but out of dignity, because I refused to let that moment define me as anything less than who I had always been. And when I looked around the table, I saw the same faces that had been there moments before, but now they carried something different: discomfort, disbelief, and in some cases, shame. Then I turned my attention to Caroline, and when I spoke, my voice did not shake, it did not rise, it carried none of the chaos that had just unfolded, because by then, my decision had already been made. I told her she would leave my house that night and never return, that she would not attend my funeral, that she would not inherit anything from me, not a single object, not a single dollar, and as the words left my mouth, I could see the shift in her expression, the first flicker of uncertainty breaking through the confidence she had carried into that room. Preston tried to intervene, his voice uncertain, suggesting that she had simply had too much to drink, that nothing needed to be decided in that moment. But I did not allow the conversation to move in that direction. I told him plainly that he had married a woman he believed would inherit an empire, and that he should understand clearly that she would not, and then I asked him to take her and leave, because there was nothing left to discuss. I did not wait for their response. I did not remain in that room any longer than necessary. I turned and walked upstairs with as much steadiness as I could maintain, each step measured despite the pain in my body, and only when I reached my bedroom and locked the door behind me did I allow myself a brief moment to sit, to feel the weight of everything that had just happened. And even then, I did not let it last long, because I knew that what came next would matter far more than what had already been done, and I had no intention of wasting time. I allowed myself exactly 4 minutes to feel everything: the pain in my ribs, the sting on my cheek, the weight of what had just been said and done. And then I stood up, walked to the mirror, and became the person I had always been when something truly mattered. Clear, focused, and entirely in control, I changed out of the blood-stained blouse, washed my face, and picked up the phone without hesitation, because I already knew what needed to be done and who needed to be involved. "Harrison, come upstairs," I told him, my voice steady. "Bring Franklin. We are going to work tonight." And within minutes, my bedroom became something else entirely, no longer a place of rest, but the starting point of a process that had been built into my life long before this night ever happened, because I had never been careless with what I created. I had protected it, structured it, prepared for possibilities that others might have dismissed as unlikely, and now those preparations would matter. By midnight, the house had grown quiet, the guests gone, the aftermath of the evening replaced by a kind of focused silence, and downstairs, my dining room transformed into a workspace where every decision was made with precision. Harrison opened his briefcase. Franklin set up his laptop, and I took my seat at the head of the table once again, not as a host, but as the person who still held full authority over everything that had been questioned just hours earlier. I began explaining what they both already understood in part, that Whitcomb Publishing was not structured in a way that could be taken, not by assumption, not by declaration, not by force of personality. It was held within a private trust, one that named me as the sole trustee with complete control over its assets and its future, meaning that no title, no position, no expectation held any real power without my consent, and more importantly, that consent could be withdrawn at any time, for any reason, in writing. Caroline, despite everything she believed, did not own a single share of the company, not one. She held a title, a salary, and access that I had granted, nothing more. Her position existed because I allowed it to exist, and that distinction, which she had never fully understood or perhaps never bothered to consider, was now the most important fact in her entire life, because it meant that everything she assumed was secure could be removed just as easily as it had been given. As the hours passed, we reviewed every document that mattered: her employment contract, the clauses that governed conduct and termination, the financial structures tied to her accounts, the loan agreements connected to her home, the trust arrangements that defined her future, and with each detail, the path forward became clearer, not driven by anger, not by revenge, but by structure, by legality, by the simple reality that everything had already been put in place long before she ever decided to raise her hand against me, and all that remained now was to act. By 2 a.m, everything had moved from decision to execution, Harrison drafting the termination letter with the kind of precise language that left no room for interpretation, every clause carefully referenced, every condition clearly met, while Franklin worked through the financial side, contacting our banking partners, flagging accounts, ensuring that access tied to Caroline's position would be suspended the moment the documents were delivered, and I sat at the table reviewing each page before signing. Not hesitating, not questioning, because nothing we were doing was impulsive. Everything followed the structure that had existed long before this night. Her employment contract made the process straightforward. The morality clause alone was enough to justify immediate termination. The public nature of the incident, witnessed by multiple credible individuals, removed any possibility of dispute, and beyond that, the damage to the company's reputation provided further grounds that no court would challenge, meaning that by the time the letter reached her hands, her role within Whitcomb Publishing would already be over in every practical sense. At the same time, Franklin finalized the notice freezing her corporate credit lines and access to company accounts, a measure that would take effect within hours, ensuring that by the time she woke up the next morning, the financial framework she had relied on would no longer respond to her, not as punishment, but as a direct consequence of losing the position that granted it, and alongside that, he prepared the demand letter for the house in Wellesley, the down payment I had once provided now formally recognized as a callable loan, a sum of $680,000 that would need to be repaid under the terms she and Preston had signed without objection years earlier. The trust documents were the final step, and perhaps the most significant, because they defined not just her present, but her entire future. I signed the affidavit revoking her status as beneficiary, a right I held without limitation, collapsing the structure that would have transferred everything I owned to her, and in its place we drafted a new designation, one that redirected those assets toward individuals and causes that reflected the values I intended to support, including a protected trust for my great-grandson, Theodore, ensuring that his future would remain secure and entirely beyond her influence. By 5 a.m, the legal framework was complete, every document printed, reviewed, and signed, each one carrying a specific consequence that would unfold the moment it reached her, and at 7:30, I personally handed the sealed envelope to a bonded courier, not delegating that final act to anyone else, because I believed in seeing things through myself, from beginning to end, and as I watched the courier leave, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a quiet certainty that what had been set in motion was both necessary and irreversible. When I returned inside, the house was silent again, the dining room restored, the traces of the previous night gone, and I sat down with a second cup of coffee as the first light of morning filled the room, knowing that somewhere else, in just a short time, Caroline would wake up to a reality she had never imagined, one not shaped by anger or confrontation, but by the simple, undeniable truth that everything she believed she controlled had never truly belonged to her at all. At Tam, Bournwe Bar that morning, Caroline woke up expecting an ordinary day, perhaps with fragments of the previous night blurred by alcohol and denial, but reality reached her before she could even leave her bed, her phone filled with missed calls, dozens of them, messages from the bank, from the company, from people she had never imagined would be contacting her with urgency, and before she could process any of it, the doorbell rang, the courier already standing outside with the envelope that would redefine everything she thought she knew about her life. Inside that envelope was not a warning, not a conversation, but a conclusion, the termination letter ending her role at Whitcomb Publishing effective immediately, the notice freezing her corporate access, the formal demand for repayment of the house loan, the affidavit collapsing her trust fund, and the legal steps that followed from each of those actions, all written clearly, professionally, without emotion, leaving no space for argument or misunderstanding, because none was necessary. What followed unfolded quickly, and exactly as it was designed to. Her attempts to access company accounts failed, her credit lines stopped responding, her position at the office no longer existed, and when she tried to return to the places she believed she still belonged, she was met with systems that no longer recognized her, doors that did not open, authority that no longer applied, and people who, while still polite, now treated her as someone entirely outside the structure she had once moved through with confidence. She tried to come back to my house, pounding on the door, calling my name, demanding to be heard, but the locks had been changed, the security updated, and when the police arrived, it was not to protect her access, but to inform her that she no longer had any right to be there, that the boundary had already been drawn and would be enforced without exception. And in that moment, the separation between us became not just emotional, but absolute in every practical sense. At the company, the transition was just as clear, her access revoked, her role reassigned, and the narrative understood quickly by those who mattered, because the evidence spoke for itself, and while no public spectacle was made of it, the truth moved through the right channels with quiet efficiency, ensuring that her professional standing shifted just as completely as her personal one had, leaving no part of her previous position intact. In the days that followed, the consequences extended beyond what she had anticipated, affecting her marriage, her social standing, the assumptions others had made about her future, and while none of it happened through confrontation or escalation, the effect was the same: her life, as she had known it, dismantled piece by piece, not through force, but through the removal of everything that had once supported it, and all of it traced back to a single moment, a single decision she had made in a dining room, believing there would be no real cost. The months that followed did not unfold with drama or noise, but with a quiet steadiness that made everything feel more real, more grounded, because once the immediate consequences had settled, what remained was not conflict, but the shape of new lives forming in the absence of old assumptions, and in that space, the truth of who people were began to show itself more clearly than it ever had before. Caroline's life changed in ways she had never imagined, not suddenly in a single moment, but gradually, as each layer of what she had depended on was replaced by something she had to build on her own. Her position reduced, her lifestyle simplified, her identity no longer supported by titles or expectations she had once taken for granted. And while I did not involve myself in the details, I was aware enough to know that she was being forced to confront something she had avoided for years, the reality of who she was without everything I had provided. Preston, in time, made his own decisions, focusing on their son, creating distance where he needed to, and ensuring that Theodore would grow up with stability. And as for Theodore, I made certain that his future remained protected, that he would never carry the consequences of choices he had no part in, because whatever had happened between adults, he was still a child who deserved consistency, care, and the opportunity to become something better than the circumstances surrounding him. Then, more than a year later, a letter arrived, handwritten, thoughtful, and entirely different from anything that had come before. Caroline did not ask for money, did not argue, did not attempt to reclaim what had been lost. Instead, she wrote about understanding, about responsibility, about finally seeing the difference between what had been given to her and what she had earned. And while words alone do not repair what has been broken, there was something in that letter that felt real. Not perfect, not complete, but real enough to be acknowledged. I read it more than once, not searching for apology, but for truth, and when I responded, I did so simply. Without reopening doors I was not ready to open, I told her that I was not prepared to see her, that I did not know if I ever would be, but that Theodore was welcome in my home, because he was not responsible for any of this, and he deserved to know where he came from. And in that decision, I found a kind of balance, not forgiveness, but something close to peace. The first time Theodore visited, he walked through my front door holding a drawing in his small hands, looking at me with curiosity instead of judgment, and when I knelt down and opened my arms, he stepped into them without hesitation, and in that moment, everything that had been lost felt smaller than what still remained, because the true measure of a life is not what is taken from you, but what you choose to carry forward. And as I stood there holding my great-grandson in the home I had built over decades, I understood that I was still exactly who I had always been, not a burden, not something to be replaced, but the woman who built the table, and the one who decides, with clarity and without apology, who is allowed to sit at it.